In this lecture, we're going to focus on slavery in the Dutch and English colonies in North America. We'll take a look at Dutch settlements, English settlements, what we'll describe as the terrible transformation, which is actually the emergence of racialized chattel slavery in the British colonies in North America, the characteristics of slavery, colonial black populations, some general characteristics of these populations, and culture and resistance in the colonies. The objectives of this lecture are first that you should be able to compare slavery in the Dutch and English colonies to slavery in the Spanish and Portuguese colonies. You should be able to outline the gradual emergence, or what is described as the terrible transformation of the institution of slavery. I'm using this term, terrible transformation, because that's the title of the part or the segment of Africans in America that you're looking at for this module. You should be able to list the principal characteristics of slavery and enslaved populations in Britain's North American colonies, to identify the ways in which Africans resisted slavery in North America, and to describe differences in slavery in the Chesapeake, the Carolinas, and Georgia, and the non-plantation North and Middle colonies. Let's take a look first at some English challenges to the Spanish. The Spanish were, of course, first in the New World, and then beginning in about the late 1500s, the English began to challenge them. Africans arrived in British North America, and what would eventually be British North America, before the 1600s. Obviously, they're with the Spanish, which we've already talked about. They're traveling throughout the Southwest with Spanish explorers like Cabeza de Vaca. They are settling in Spanish colonies like St. Augustine. So they are already in North America before the 1600s. Religious identity and the practical demands of survival mattered more in these early colonial settlements than physical appearance or ethnic background. And about 50% overall, about 50% of all the people who crossed the Atlantic were African. That's a startling number when we think about what these colonies will eventually look like. But again, this is for the whole period of this migration of populations from the Old World to the New World. First, we'll look at the Dutch settlements. The Dutch settled in their colony of New Amsterdam in 1624. The Dutch obviously had been involved in the slave trade, so it was pretty natural that they would eventually have slaves working on the Dutch farms, or plantations as they call them, in the Dutch colonies. The status of blacks in the Dutch colonies depended on location, the patterns of what were described as half freedom, in which these early black Dutch settlers had some rights and privileges within the Dutch colonies. And one of the rights and privileges that they had was a privilege of land ownership. See page 57 in your textbook for some more information on these patterns of settlement. They were also active in the courts. Blacks were active in the courts. They could sue or they could be sued in the courts. They were permitted to marry in the Dutch Reformed Church. They mixed with their white neighbors and very often conducted independent trade in the colonies. They bought and sold their own goods and produced their own products, which they sold. They served in the militias. And by 1650, New Netherlands was importing the largest number of slaves, or the largest slave importation center in North America. New Netherlands, New York, it is the Dutch colony. In 1664, the British took over the Dutch colonies. There was no violent revolution. They just simply sailed into the harbor and assumed control of those Dutch colonies. By that time, about 1/10 of the population, 1/4 of the population in the capital of New York was African. The Swedes and the Finns also had colonies on the Delaware River in which they used slave labor as well. And their colonies were taken over by the Dutch, and then the colonies of the Dutch were eventually taken over by the British. All of this by the mid-1660s. The first British settlements, permanent British settlements in North America, was at Jamestown in 1607. And this was, of course, the colony that was created by the Joint Stock Company, the Virginia Company. It was a colony that was set up to make money. The first settlers, however, were not really equipped to deal with exploiting the land. They came over looking for gold. They came over thinking that they would discover gold in much the same way that the Spanish had discovered gold in some of their colonies. They would just simply pick it up off the ground, or they would just simply, seize it from the Indians. But no such luck. They were not equipped to work very hard. That early colony in Jamestown experienced a starving time before they began to cultivate crops and to discover a very profitable crop, and that was tobacco. The British also established a colony further north, and that was the colony of Plymouth in 1620, settled by the Pilgrims, and Massachusetts Bay in 1630, settled by the Puritans. So in a sense, if you look back at these early colonies, by 1630, the British had some pretty permanent settlements that had developed in North America. The first Africans were brought over to the colony of Jamestown in 1619. And this, of course, is described in your textbook. This is when the Dutch trading vessel, which had actually seized a cargo of slaves from a Spanish vessel. The Dutch sailed the ship into the ship or boat or whatever into the colony of Jamestown because they were in need of supplies. And they traded the Africans for these supplies. So in a sense, that song that kind of weaves all the way through the Africans in America series, before the Pilgrims landed, we were there, really focuses on this idea that Africans are in North America before the Pilgrims came to Plymouth in 1620. In these early colonial settlements, religious and political differences were much more important than physical differences. These were the key areas of division. Those early colonies in Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay had been settled by the Puritans and the Pilgrims, who were seeking freedom to practice their own religion. Now, there are some differences in the patterns of settlements of these colonies also. Those who came to Jamestown came as individuals looking for quick profit or quick wealth. Those who settled in Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay very often came as family units or as even communities. And their goal was to set up a model community. You can see this very clearly with Massachusetts Bay, to create this model community. And even in Massachusetts Bay, we always talk about the Puritans coming over and settling, and this Puritan settlement, this Puritan colony that emerges. But as far as the Puritan migrations on the whole to the Western Hemisphere, there were much larger numbers of Puritans who were going to the West Indies than to Massachusetts Bay. Bondage in these colonies was very often generally not for life. In Jamestown and in the southern colonies as they emerged, most of the people who came over from Europe came as indentured servants. And that meant that they paid all or a portion of their passage was paid by someone else in exchange for their agreement to work for this person or for these people or for the company for a set number of years. This was also the status that was given to that first group of Africans who came over in 1619, because technically in the British colonies, in Britain in general, there was no status of permanent bound labor. They didn't have this in the British law at that time, as opposed to the Spanish, who have this las siete partidas, or the 7 parts that relate to permanent enslavement within their legal code, within the Castilian legal code. That did not exist within the British legal code. So those who came over as indentured servants to work for a certain number of years, 3 to 7 years, depending on how much of their passage they were able to pay. And then at the end of that 7 years, they would be given freedom dues. It could be a gun, it could be money, it could be access to land. That in the early years, when there was plenty of land, they would be given some land that they could cultivate. But the conditions for the unfree populations began to change by the mid, not the mini or whatever, there's a spelling error here, but by the mid-17th century. By the middle of the 1600s, you start to see this transformation in the laws, so that you will begin to see the emergence of a status of permanent bound labor. So the transformation that is taking place, this terrible transformation that is taking place, is a transformation in terms of labor, from a system where labor was bound labor, labor that was controlled by someone else, was limited. It could not be permanent, to a system where it does become permanent, and not only that, that it becomes racialized. The timing and the nature of this development of racialized chattel slavery differed from colony to colony. And the colonial sections that we're dealing with, or we're looking at from this point on, are the Chesapeake colonies of Maryland and Virginia. The other southern colonies, south of Virginia, the Carolinas and Georgia, and then the non-plantation north and the middle colonies. So the whole way in which slavery develops in British North America depends on where you are and what time period you're looking at. First, we'll deal with this question of why African slavery. And to a great extent, this is based on kind of a reverse question. Why not continue English indentured servitude or the use of Native American labor? Why is there an option? Why do the settlers opt to use African labor and to make their system of labor a racialized system? If we look at the English, if we kind of take it from the point of view of the English, why not the English? It's because by the mid to the late 1700s, it's becoming harder to get English laborers. English servants in the colonies were demanding shorter terms, better working conditions, and suitable farm labor when their terms ended. Bad treatment that they received meant the loss of laborers to other colonies. If these workers discovered that in Virginia, for example, or in the Carolinas, for example, they were treated very poorly, then they would simply, the next group of indentured servants would prefer to sign on to colonies, to settlements in the Chesapeake or in Maryland, Virginia or in Maryland, in the Chesapeake region. It's also this question of the fears of this growing population of poor, landless, former indentured servants, the chaos that this could cause. And again, in part 1 of Africans in America, this is what you see happening, this growing chaos that could be created by this wandering class of poor farmers who had been indentured servants but who were now free. Now, why not Native Americans? Well, there's a problem of relationships between the settlers and the Indians. If you're going to enslave Indian populations, then you'll have poor relationships with the other Native Americans who are around there. They could easily escape. They knew the land better than many of the settlers, and they were limited in numbers. And then in terms of Africans, so we turn this around, why use or promote African labor? Africans were thousands of miles from their people. If you mistreated European indentured servants, because the ships are going back and forth between Europe and North America, the word will get back to them. If you mistreat African laborers, it's less likely that the information will go back to people in Africa who are supplying the slaves, and if it does, it won't have the same impact. The numbers increased as the scope of the trade expanded. Once the Royal Africa Company loses its monopoly of the trade in 1698, then there are more independent traders who are developing more and more voyages that will bring Africans, larger numbers of Africans, to the New World. It's like free trade and opening of trade, because anybody can take a little ship and go to Africa and bring more slaves over. The legal transformation, again, of the legal development of slavery is really shown very clearly in Part 1 of Africans in America, which you're looking at for this module. The first 30 minutes deals with what happens in the Chesapeake, in Maryland, and Virginia. The last 30 minutes deals with what is happening in the Carolinas, and you'll see some differences in the way in which these colonies develop, and the way in which slavery develops in the Chesapeake region, and the way in which it develops in the Carolinas and Georgia. Georgia is, of course, the last of the colonies to be established in 1730. By the end of the 1600s, Africans were arriving directly from Africa as well as from the West Indies. Larger numbers as the Royal Africa Company loses their monopoly and free trade increases or emerges as a very profitable part of the slave trade. And the crucial factors in this transformation are, number one, discontent and cooperation among poor and unfree people. That when you have this system of indentured servants that includes not only European indentured servants, but also Africans who are given that status of indentured servant, once they are free, then they also become a part of this poor population of roving people, landless people for the most part, and they see connections developing that can develop between black and white for economic reasons. Okay, if you're poor and you're black, and you're poor and you're white, and you're poor and you're landless white, poor landless black, there's a possibility of cooperation that does not really please the landed people in the colonies. There's also this lack of feedback within African migrant populations, and then the removal of the restriction on Christianity, the restriction that it said that you could not enslave a person who was Christian. Well, when they began to see that larger numbers of Africans were converting to Christianity because this meant that they could not be enslaved, then that legal restriction is removed, and Christianity is no deterrent to the growth of slavery. So, what are the characteristics of slavery in the British colonies in North America by the early 1700s? First of all, it is slavery for life. It is hereditary. It is hereditary in a different way from the way in which heredity applied to Europeans in all other areas, or to free people in all other areas of British law. You inherit your status as a slave based on the status of your mother when you are born. So this is something that is passed down as a hereditary condition from mother to child. It's something that your mother passes on to you, as opposed to most other laws of inheritance in the British colonies and British North America, where property, for example, is inherited based on your father, the wealth of your father, or in some cases based on your mother. Very prosperous, widowed women in the colonies passed their property on, but your status, your wealth and your status, traditionally depended on the wealth and the status of your father. In this case of slavery, your status depends on the status of your mother. Third, it is confined to blacks and to a lesser extent to Indians. So it is a racialized form of servitude. And then finally, slaves are chattel. They are the personal private property of their owners. They can be bought, sold, deeded, willed, lost in a card game, whatever. They are personal private property. Now, what does this black population look like in colonial America by the 1700s? In terms of numbers, their numbers are small before 1675. Then between 1675 and 1777, the number increases to about 300,000 blacks in the colonies. And between 1775 and 1807, an additional 100,000. Now, still during this period, if we look back at the numbers of blacks, of Africans that are transported to the New World, in terms of British North America, only about 5% of that number wind up in British North America. The sources during the colonial period, for the most part, the Africans who arrive in British North America are what are called saltwater Africans, meaning they're coming directly from the African coast rather than transshipped from the West Indies. The population, black population in colonial North America by the late 1600s is increasing through natural increase rather than through the infusion of more and more Africans, people coming directly from Africa. Now, this is a key difference between what is happening in the colonies in South America. In South America, the increase in the slave population and the black population is brought about because you're constantly bringing over more and more people from Africa. So you have millions and millions of Africans who are brought to the Caribbean and to South America, where they are in many cases literally worked to death. They are expendable because they can always go back and bring more. But in British North America, the increase increases through natural increase. So you go from 400,000, 500,000 to 500,000 to 2 million to 3 million, and it's through natural increase. Those arriving in North America tended to live longer than those who were transported to the Caribbean and South America. And increasingly, those who are arriving in North America are able to form families. You also have, for this black population, the development of strict legal codes in all of the colonies. You have a public acceptance of brutal treatment to enforce these legal codes, and increasing hostility toward mixed marriages or mixed racial, sexual relationships. But you do occasionally have, among this population, some people who do get back, who are able to return to Africa. But this is a small number compared to the millions who are brought to the Western Hemisphere and the hundreds of thousands who end up in British North America. Be sure to read the stories about Job Ben Solomon and Olaudah Equiano and what happens to them. You know, how are they able to get back to Africa? In terms of trends in the transatlantic slave trade, this is important because this will determine what the black population in North America will look like. Between 1619 and 1665 overall, what is this slave trade contributing to the population in British North America? Well, the numbers are very small coming into the colonies in the early period. After the Royal African Company loses their monopoly on the trade, the numbers start to increase between 1680 and 1730. At this same time, the numbers of white indentured servants who are coming over begin a decline steadily. So you've got the buildup of increasing trade, more Africans brought over during this period. You've got the decline in the number of white indentured servants. You've got the development by 1700 of this status of permanent bound racialized servitude. So all of this comes together to create slavery in British North America. The slave trade is very brisk between the 1730s, from the 1730s to 1776. Then it slows down during the Revolutionary War. This is a global conflict, and the slave trade is essentially decreased during this period. It picks up into North America, into the United States, just after the Revolutionary War, and is active until the legal end of the trade in 1808. However, the smuggling of slaves from Africa continues between 1808 and 1865. So contraband slaves continue to be brought into the United States even after the legal end to the trade in 1808. By 1775, there are about 500,000 blacks in the British colonies. Only a small number of that 500,000 are free. This population included recently arrived Africans, those who had lived in the colonies or the West Indies, and then Creoles, or those who were native born of African and American descent, mixed race people, or people who were of pure African descent, but they were born in British North America. Most of them are living on plantations in the South, in the Chesapeake colonies, in the Carolinas, or in Georgia. And by the 17th century, you have the beginnings of a uniquely African American culture, which is a synthesis, in many cases, of African, European, and Native American traditions. One example of this, a question that I'd like for you to kind of find in your textbook, find the answer in your book. Where did the custom of jumping the broom come from? Is it African or not? Okay, let's look at the status of slavery in the colonies. In any particular colony, it depended on several things. In other words, what is slavery going to look like? How is it going to be practiced in North Carolina as opposed to New York? So, what is the status of slavery and what will it look like? It depends on the character and the composition of the slave trade at a particular time. Are there a lot of Africans coming in, reinfusing African traditions and culture into this African American population that's emerged? Are there few Africans, and those Africans who are coming in, are they being put into situations where they are the minority in a population that is overwhelmingly Creole or native-born African American? So the character and the composition of the slave trade. It depends on the characteristics of a colony's economy and labor system. What are they producing? Those who are producing rice in the Carolinas developed slavery for them was very different from, say, those who are producing tobacco in Virginia, or Maryland, or those who are working on small farms in Massachusetts. So we're looking at this question of what is being produced and by whom is it being produced. Status of slavery depends on the numbers of blacks and whites in the colony. What was the only colony that had a black majority? And it depends on the degree of interaction between Africans, African Americans, Europeans, and Indians. Now, a quick look at this process of culture building. Remember that family is the basis of everything, political, social, economic, in African societies. Families will also develop Africans will also develop families in colonial America. In colonial North America, these families, the development of families, is encouraged by owners as well as by slaves themselves. Now, why would the owners encourage it? They realized that people were more vulnerable when they had families. They were easier to control in many ways when they had families. If they had needy loved ones who depended on them, they were often less likely to think about escape. However, owners and the legal system itself did not recognize legal marriage between slaves because this tended to limit the owner's power. Instead, they encouraged long-term relationships. They got the labor, they got the potential for increasing their slave populations, and they got a way of controlling the slaves. Why would the slaves want families? They need to share their suffering and the rare pleasures that they had with other people. Raising children was, as one writer described it, a greater affirmation than living without children. The development of extended families played an important part in transmitting this new African American culture that's developing. It fostered ideas of loyalty and trust. It was a way of conveying information and belief systems. And families could be strong shelters in which people could hide if they happened or needed to escape. Some other components of culture that develops during this period: music. It's a form of shared experience that they have. And the music black music during this period is a blending of African traditions and opportunities in a new setting. Drums are one common denominator, but on the other hand, drums were one musical instrument that was feared by the colonists because they knew that drums were used as a way of communicating information in Africa, and the same would be true in North America. In 1740, after South Carolina passed a new legal code applying to blacks in the colonies, the South Carolina Negro Code, they actually banned drums among the slave population. Language, to a great extent, in some African societies, you have African carryovers in the language patterns. But this depended on the interaction, the amount of interaction that you're going to have between Africans and non-Africans. It depended on the isolation of some African populations as to whether they're going to be able to continue language patterns that they bring over from Africa. For example, in the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina, you have the development of an essentially isolated African or black culture that emerges among the Gullah people on the Sea Islands. Clothing, housing, hairstyles, food preparation, celebrations, all of these were very, very important aspects of the culture, as well as religion. We will come back to this discussion of religion a little later, but it is important to realize that for this first generation or so of Africans in the British colonies, as in the South American colonies, they were not as likely to accept Christianity as a religion. They held on to some of their old traditions and beliefs until the mid-1700s, until the Great Awakening of the 1700s. Now, in terms of resistance, like in the Spanish colonies, there's no single effective model of resistance. Among slaves, they used a variety of strategies for resisting slavery. There were small acts of resistance like faking illness, slowing down labor, flight or escape, sometimes permanent, sometimes just simply temporary to get away from a situation for a while. They used arson, poisoning, attacking overseers, attacking owners. There were some large conspiracies that were planned in New York City in 1712, in Louisiana in 1731. And there was also escape to Florida and Spanish colonies. The Spanish actually gave sanctuary to slaves who escaped out of South Carolina or the other southern colonies. They gave sanctuary at a site called Mose or Mose, which actually grew into a community of slaves or free blacks just across the Spanish border. And then you also had the resistance that you see in terms of rebellion. And in this case, it is the Stono Rebellion of the mid-1730s. Now, this concludes our look at the colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And we'll move on in the next module and just take a look at what is happening during this Revolutionary War period and the aftermath of the Revolutionary War. Please be sure to look at the, go online or go to the website and take a look at the videotape, Africans in America, Part 1. Look at the whole videotape. It's about 90 minutes. And in the general instructions for the module, there are a couple of questions I'd like you to think about as you look at the videotape.